Hey everybody, this is Jeff Martin of Magic City Books. We're going to hold for just a minute and make sure everybody is in the Zoom room before we get going. So just bear with us for just a moment so we don't have to do our introductions twice. Imagine some kind of hold music of some kind. Okay, hey everybody, this is Jeff Martin with Magic City Books. I'm so thrilled to have you all here with us for this really special Sunday night event. We usually do kind of Mondays and Thursdays, but obviously, as you know, this was kind of a special opportunity that we have here. So I want to tell you about a couple things coming up. We're going to be doing a really fun conversation this Thursday evening with John Dinsmore, the legendary drummer of The Doors. He's got a new book out, so we're going to be talking about music and Jim Morrison and drugs and who knows what else and all kinds of things and creativity and how all that works. So that's going to be this Thursday. And then we're kind of taking a break, much deserved break. And this is, I was telling Rachel before we got on here that we're kind of closing in on doing 100 virtual events since this pandemic has started. And it's been quite a bit of, there's been a learning curve and we've gotten better as we've gone, but we've had amazing guests. So, we've had everybody from, Margaret Atwood and Matthew McConaughey and Aaron Brockovich and Ta-Nehisi Coates and, all kinds of wonderful people, different kinds of books. And I've always told you guys that what we've been trying to do is to give you a mixtape of sorts where, we'll talk about things that matter, talk about issues that are kind of looking at us right now, but also giving you a break, having some moments of respite, having some laughs, but also creating that balance where we can be doing that. And we'll keep doing that into the new year, into the spring, I would imagine into the summer. And when we begin doing real events again with actual human beings in person, I'm guessing that will be kind of a hybrid model and we'll be doing maybe some outdoor things. And this virtual thing, there's so many of you who are watching from other states that don't have any clue what Magic City Books is. It's been a great way to meet new people and reach new audiences. So we'll keep doing these as they become available to us. If you don't know about Magic City Books is here in downtown Tulsa. Tulsa has gotten a lot of news over the last couple of years in the public sphere. We're about 2 blocks actually from the historic Greenwood neighborhood, which was the site of the 1921 Tulsa race massacre, which many of you may have read about or know about. And if you don't, I would encourage you to look at. We're coming up on the centennial of that event next year. And we are kind of a different thing. We're a nonprofit bookstore. So when people come in and they buy a book, the money goes back into the programming that we do, just like this. So by you buying a ticket for this event tonight, you're supporting community programming like this and doing some really good work, not to mention just supporting independent bookstores. One bookstore on average a week has gone out of business, independent bookstore, since the beginning of the pandemic. And now we're many, many, many months into this. And that really adds up and has an impact around the country and on the different communities where those bookstores have been, some of them quite long-standing. So we appreciate you doing that for us. It's been a pretty amazing opportunity. I want to say a big thank you to Crown, the publisher of this book we're going to be talking about tonight, for in a lot of ways, and I hope they know this, that they've really provided us with some amazing events over the last year that have in some ways not just kept us afloat, but I think we're going to end the year in a really great place. We'll be in the black, and a lot of that will be due to some of the programming that has been provided to us through not just Crown, but all these publishers who have taken a chance on us and reached out to us. Last year, 2019 was our best year yet. A lot of it was because we had an event last fall with Rachel Maddow here in person. We had thousands of people here for that event. It was our most profitable event and most largely attended event we've ever had, and really had a huge impact on our organization. And for the second opportunity to do that this year, at the end of this year, is such a blessing for our organization and gives us an opportunity to, move into 2021 in a much more hopeful situation. So thank you for supporting that. I can't wait to talk to Rachel tonight again. It's such a huge honor to get to do this twice. in 2 years. We're going to talk about Bagman. I hope you guys will have questions. If you do, please put those into the Q&A, and I'll try to get to some of those as we go. And without any further ado, I want to say a huge hello, welcome to our good friend, Rachel Maddow. Hello, Rachel. There she is.
This is very overwhelming. It's overwhelming to do this with you in person, Jeff, but to just like pop out of the screen, it's a different kind of nervous making. This is fantastic.
Yeah, it's like the end of the Wizard of Oz or something. Who is that person behind the black square? Well, welcome. It's so thrilling to have you here. I hope that you're doing well. I hope that your household is healthy and getting better and better. I know you've gone through some issues. We don't need to get into all of that. I'm sure everybody watching has heard you speak about that, but I hope you are doing well.
We are. Thank you. Yeah.
Congratulations on the book. You know, I think I maybe had heard a hint of this possibility happening when your team was here last year. But I was just curious, one, I guess to begin, where did you find the time in this crazy ass year to do this? I know you had a co-author. I think we should also mention this was done in partnership with Michael Yarvitz, who was the co-author here. So, you know, obviously it was not done solely alone, but I recall you saying that you didn't plan on doing another book anytime soon. I think I heard you say that. So how are we here tonight?
Yeah, it turns out I'm a liar. I had no intention at all of doing another book. Mike is somebody who worked on the Rachel Maddow show for a long time, and he and I are just really copacetic. Like we really editorially have always had a lot of fun time, a lot of real fun working together. And he left to go pursue other things. He moved to California, and he was going to go get into Hollywood and do stuff and everything. But we kept talking about stuff that we were interested in. We came to the Bagman idea together, not knowing exactly what we wanted to do with it. Did we want Mike to come back to the Rachel Maddow show to do a special on it? Or did we want to just like incorporate it into the news? We landed on the podcast thing, and we both just fell in love with the story. I mean, we're going to talk tonight about what I like about the story and what I think is important about it. But part of what we realized and why it's been so rewarding to keep working on it is that there isn't a big body of work about what happened to Agnew. There were a couple of contemporaneous, really good, there were good newspaper articles. There's a couple really good magazine articles. There was one book that was written very close to the time that Agnew resigned, but then nobody else has really been plumbing these depths. And the reason we ended up writing the book, honestly, is because we didn't stop researching the story when the podcast was over, and we dug up new stuff, and we were super excited about it. And we put a little bit of it on TV. I went back and did an Agnew segment or two on the Rachel Maddow show. But some of the stuff that we learned, particularly about Agnew's case having been the genesis for the Justice Department policy that a president can't be indicted, as that became more and more important in the Trump era, it felt more and more pressing that we sort of tell the world what we learned about that. Also, some of the really disturbing stuff that we learned about Agnew in his post-White House life is something that we just felt we needed to get out there. And so we ended up writing a book around those ideas. And I don't know.
Well, that piece you mentioned about the memo, the Justice Department memo, it seems like very much the seed in some ways for this whole thing, and in a way it's kind of analogous to the world we're living in now. But I guess let's go back a little bit. You had not done a podcast before. This was your first podcast, obviously as a large project. That in and of itself is a pretty huge undertaking, because that I'm sure most, I wouldn't say most, but I would imagine a lot of our viewers have listened to this. And if you haven't, I would encourage you to do so. It's a great companion. I actually have been back listening to it while reading the book. And you also made a good point too. If you've heard the show, it's not as if you will know everything that's in this book. The book is a continuation of the show. It's not a mirror reflection of the show, correct?
Yeah, that's right. So, I mean, it's the same story writ large. And so you'll get the same arc. And if you've heard the podcast, you know how it ends, including that dramatic moment in the courtroom where Agnew's late to plead guilty and nobody knows if he's resigned and all that stuff. All that's there, but there is more, both in terms of what happened inside the Justice Department, but also what happened after the story ended and Agnew sort of retreated into obscurity, but just became an unbelievable scumbag in his retired life.
Were you consciously looking, because you do such a great job on the show of using history, especially in that first, you call it a block, what do you call those first segments?
The A block.
A block, of using those kind of long form narrative pieces to kind of, and sometimes what I love about it is I have no idea where you're going, for like the first 5 minutes, but I trust the fact that you're going to get me somewhere that connects back to something happening today or recently, and you do. But were you looking consciously for some story to tell that would help you understand this world that we're living in more? Like, what was the genesis for wanting to do it at all?
I think the initial genesis was that, particularly in this era, it feels like we do use the word unprecedented too much. But that's because the kind of scandal and corruption and criminality that we've been contending with in this presidency feels so overwhelming and so brazen that it feels like it must be unprecedented. And I sort of wanted to fact check myself on that in terms of what White House denizens have gotten away with or tried to get away with in the past. So that was definitely part of it. But the other part of it, which I sort of, once I started looking into the Agnew story, and I will admit that the first time that I was writing about Agnew and thinking about Agnew was specifically for A-block storytelling purposes. But the reason I stuck with it and decided to expand this and make this sort of parallel thing alongside my day job is not actually because of what's bad about Agnew. It's about the good guys in the story. And that part I felt like, oh, you know what? This actually needs to be handled with great care and at some length. And it needs to be done in a way that does right by these prosecutors and these Justice Department figures who actually are models of patriotic public service here. When we learned about the kind of pressure that the U.S. Attorney had been put under by his own brother, who was a senator, who Agnew and Nixon had helped into the Senate, by George H.W. Bush, who is the head of the Republican Party, by the Nixon White House, by the Attorney General who preceded Elliot Richardson. We learned about the kind of pressure that he got. And we were the first to discover that he received that pressure and never passed it on to his subordinates. So the line prosecutors never knew. That's when I sort of felt like, all right, well, the story of George Bell has to be told. And the story of Elliot Richardson has to be told. We tell each other, as Americans, we tell each other stories of patriotic heroism in public service, I think, to give us all things to aim at, to give us models of the way we all hope we would believe when we would behave if our country needed us. And this is that kind of story. The good guys here need to be more celebrated than they have been.
Your previous two books, Drift and Blowout, they're heavy topics and they're deep dives into things that I know you're passionate about, but things that are not fun necessarily. This reads as kind of a pot boiler. It's it's got a fun narrative arc to it, and it seems like you guys had a good time crafting that narrative. Was that something that you spent time on? Did that kind of, obviously the podcast has that propelling narrative and you need that for that format, but you translated it really well to the book. Was it more fun to work on this project than some of your previous books?
This is definitely, this is not like the civilian military divide or like how fracking changed the geopolitics of the oil and gas business to explain Putinism and why it turned to malfactory tech. I mean, it's not, I mean, there's, I'm a dork. I'm an 8-year-old trapped in a 47-year-old's body. And so in all of my books, there's always going to be like something akin to a fart joke here and there. Like I'm incapable of turning off the snark. But you are right that this is more of a romp than anything else. And part of it is that Agnew did go away. He didn't become president. And so the worst things that could have happened here were headed off by the heroic actions of our heroes. And that gives you, that lets you, I think, treat it a little more lightly. But also it's true crime in a way. I mean, this is a guy literally taking envelopes stuffed with cash inside the White House and the expensive jewelry that turns up in the IRS investigation, which is not for his wife, Judy, and his ridiculous like hero worship of Frank Sinatra turning up and all this stuff, and them camping out at Frank's Palm Springs retreat. And every time he was hanging out with Frank, he'd get a little crazier in terms of the way he talked about his enemies. And I mean, all that stuff is, history is here to help, and history has serious lessons for us, I think, here, but there is some whack stuff here too that's hard not to laugh at.
One of our viewers, Laura, asked a question that I think touches on something I was really interested in too. It says, Rachel, you're the rare bird who has done all three. Can you compare and contrast the research and production between book writing, podcast production, and a TV show? Is it the same thing? And will you ever return to doing more podcasts?
Oh, I've now humbled myself by having been proven a liar about no more books. So I'm reluctant to make any predictions about what else I will or won't do. Whenever I finish a thing, I always say, I'm never doing anything ever again. This is it. I'm toast. The basics of all storytelling are the same, right? You need to find the story, understand the story, in some cases report the story, fact check the story, and then decide if it is helpful to tell. If it, our sort of motto on the show is that we try to increase the amount of useful information in the world. And that's true for what I do at MSNBC, but I think in general, that's true for the way that I approach projects. And I've never set out to be like, oh, I want to write another book. What should the next book be? Or I want to do a podcast. What should the podcast be? I tend to be driven to do the next thing. The format tends to be driven by what the content is. And so part of the reason that it made sense to do Bagman as a podcast in the outset was because part of what broke that story open was that there were White House tapes and diaries, the White House diaries, that nobody had ever used to tell the Agnew story before. Everybody had been so interested in what was on those in terms of Watergate that nobody had ever played publicly or broadcast the stuff that was available as an audio document. And so it felt like it needed to be broadcast, and it needed to be put in a streamable format in some way, or downloadable format in some way, rather than going straight to a book. That said, with the book, being able to publish the visuals, like one of the things that we published like as an insert in the book is the list by one of the guys who was being extorted by Agnew, was paying him bribes, of the date that he gave the money to the bagman, how much it was on that date. And then he had a little note called, another column called remarks. And it would be like, on the boat, or like in the casino, or where else, something else memorable to him about when he paid that exact bribe. And he typed it all up, and you can actually access the document from the archives that we plumbed in order to do this. So that those things, they don't let go. Like they want to be known, they want to be heard, they want to be out there.
Yeah. It does seem like, when you look at kind of your history and where you came from and the path you've taken, it does seem like the thing you would have most obviously done was write books. I'm sure that's something that you plan. Writing was something that you've done a lot in your life. You did it, of course, in your higher education, all that stuff. So I'm sure that was something you considered more than you ever considered maybe having a nightly TV show, as a young person. But do you feel like you've gotten to write enough? Do you feel like you've written as much as you wanted to write?
Yeah, I still have this weird dynamic, which is true even after 3 books now, which is that I find writing for the eye to be much more intimidating and much more painful than writing for the ear. Like when I write my TV show every night, I'm writing something that I'm then gonna say. And I just don't, part of it is the daily production challenge of that. You don't have the luxury of having writer's block or having too much pride of authorship, or you don't have enough time to get stuck on any one particular thing. Things got to be on the air at a specific time, go, go, go. But the other part of it is that I know I'm going to speak it. And so if it's not perfect, or if it's not exactly the way I want it to come out, I know I can ad lib around it because it's my script. It's, my reporting, it's my information. I know what I mean. And, if what I wrote pops up in the teleprompter and I actually want to say it a different way, I can say it a different way in the moment. And that kind of stylistic safety net that I can riff a little bit when I write a script it makes writing a script much easier for me than writing something that's going to be committed to type and put onto a piece of paper that people will keep. It's just much harder. So books, even fun books like Bagman, which are a little bit of a romp and have lots of bizarre, fantastic material that sort of wants to write itself, even that is harder for me than the other kind of writing that I do.
Yeah. One of our viewers, Nancy, asked a good question, which is, how did Nixon even come to choose Agnew as his VP?
It's a great question and a great story, and actually one that could be even expanded more than it is in the book. So there was a guy named Pat Buchanan. Yes.
Heard of him.
That Pat Buchanan, Uncle Pat, who had, you might be aware, a real keen ear for racial animus turned to political profit. And he loved what Agnew did in Maryland politics, specifically around the issue of race. After the assassination of Martin Luther King and rioting in Baltimore, Agnew had become governor of Maryland almost by accident. He was a Republican, but there was a Democratic machine politics in Maryland that had really controlled Maryland politics for a long time, but there were two competing Democratic machines. And what happened the year that Agnew became governor is that the two Democratic machines basically ate each other. They crashed in a way that actually prevented the Democratic Party from mounting a viable candidate for governor that year. And so the guy who ended up running on the Democratic Party ticket that year in Maryland was a freaking kook, was like a perennial candidate, crazy person who was overtly endorsed by the Ku Klux Klan and was like this, like a crazy person, like a braid his beard hair crazy person. And Nixon and Agnew was the Republican. And so Agnew actually got elected in a way that sort of made him look like a moderate, because he got lots of Democratic votes, because real Democrats, particularly Black Maryland Democrats, didn't want to vote for the Klan guy who braids his beard hair. And so Agnew sort of looked like he was going to be a moderate mid-Atlantic governor, and he got in there, and it turns out he could race bait with the best of them. And the surprise factor with that, for people who hadn't been paying very close attention to how he came to power, and the way that he did it for show, the way that he essentially race baited and attacked Black leadership in Maryland for his own political benefit, and always made sure that those kind of things were televised. And he was just acrid in his rhetoric and in his tactics against Black Marylanders. And Pat Buchanan loved that, and they knew that Nixon was going to have trouble on his racist right flank from George Wallace, who was going to run and going to capture some Deep South states. And they thought having a more erudite, but just as aggressive racist on the ticket in the form of Agnew would help them win states that were sort of considered to be not Deep South, but still Southern states. And he did help with that. And it was just pure calculus. It wasn't any personal thing between them. Nobody had ever heard of Spiro Agnew. It really was a race play orchestrated by a very young, very keen-eyed Pat Buchanan.
So I know that you know Pat Buchanan, right?
Uncle Pat.
And it's interesting to me, how do you square the circle of obviously someone that you know has done these things, but then in person, you might be really affectionate toward them, or you have a nice relationship with, they're nice to you, whatever. I'm sure that happens a lot in this world we live in. How do you kind of find a balance between those things?
Yeah, I mean, I've been doing this type of work long enough that there's a lot of people who fit that description. And I'm enough of a softie that I kind of have to not falsely, but I have to like deliberately engineer my interactions with people in a way that sort of defeat the bias that might otherwise arise from somebody being a nice person. Like I'm saying this in a way that's too clumsy, but I don't want to be friends with anybody who I'm covering. Like I don't want to go to dinner parties with people so that I can cultivate them as a source, so I can use their blind quotes in stories about their political rivals. Like I do not want that. I don't want that. I don't want to be personally engaged with anybody who I'm covering because they might turn out to be a really bad person. And if I feel soft and squishy about them and have met their cat and, like their kids and have overlapping interests or whatever, it might make me soft on them. And so I just try not to know anybody, which is a terrible thing. But I mean, I'm sort of an introvert anyway, but I try to sort of keep things professional because I am swayed by people who do terrible things for the country who ought to be called out for it, being nice people. And so I try to just keep to myself.
This reminds me of like the last line of Catcher in the Rye or something. We need to look that up. There's something about knowing people there. So I'm curious. We've had a lot of questions about the indicting the president guideline and whether that will ever change. A lot of people are asking kind of a similar question about, given what's happening now, is there any traction that will ever change or become something more concrete than a memo, a law of any kind? Do you see any world where that will be codified in any real way?
Well, I think actually telling the Agnew origin story of that policy should help make that a live question. I mean, I don't have a dog in the fight. I'm not advocating for the Justice Department to change its policy, but I do think that policy is really, really, really consequential in a way that you can see clearly once a guy named Individual 1 is the president of the United States. And given how much weight that policy is bearing in terms of the rule of law and the legitimate authority of the executive branch, it's worth knowing that it's got a really wobbly pedestal that it is sitting on. I mean, the memo that was drafted to answer the question of whether or not Agnew could be indicted is a piece of work. And it was created that way, basically to try to create this very narrowly tailored answer that would serve Nixon's needs at the time. Nixon didn't want Agnew to be impeached. He thought that if the impeachment machinery got going, that it would take him out too. But then by saying that Agnew, because Agnew could be indicted, because that's the way you stop impeachment, right? Is by saying, oh no, don't impeach him. He's already being indicted. That would be duplicative. By saying Agnew can be indicted, Nixon, of course, is opening the door that he could be indicted too. And so this memo was created that said, Agnew can be indicted, but Nixon can't. And so, don't impeach Agnew, but don't indict Nixon. It really was created as this sort of hodgepodge patchwork in order to answer the political imperatives of the moment, which is that we had two felons in the presidency and the vice presidency who had both committed different sets of unrelated crimes, who were each trying to kill each other, proverbially speaking, or although Agnew later said that Nixon was literally trying to kill him. And that's a very peculiar circumstance on which to base like a constitutional plinth on which the republic's going to rise or fall once we get a new felon in the White House. So I'm hoping that telling this story makes the OLC memo more of a live question. It's been revisited multiple times since 1973, but it's not well argued and it's never been tested. And it will be very interesting to see what happens when Trump is no longer president and the line prosecutors who named him Individual 1 and any other prosecutors who found him to have been involved in potential criminal activity during the course of his candidacy or presidency, when they call that question. I think that'll be part of putting it back on the table.
On the flip side of that, I'm curious, let's say in a hypothetical that did change and it became, a real possibility to indict a sitting president. Does the fact that the Justice Department sits in the executive branch always make that problematic if that happens, because it would get used for, it's at that point, it's so available to be misused at that point, knowing what we know about political parties?
Yes. Yeah, there's no good answers here. I mean, the best answer is to not have crooks be president. But the idea of indicting a sitting president is, like on a simple basis, super compelling and feels like no one's above the law and justice would be done. When you think about how it would actually play out, what the logistics of it would be, it's anybody who's telling you that it would be simple or cut and dried is not looking at it closely enough. It would be very, very difficult. But similarly, Jeff, I mean, the prospect of indicting a president as soon as he left office. I mean, we are, as you know, as outraged as the country was when Ford pardoned Nixon, there's good arguments on both sides of that. I mean, as outraged as I was, and I think a lot of people were when the Obama administration and Attorney General Eric Holder decided that there would be no prosecutions of the previous administration for torture. There's honest and honorable arguments to make about that. If we become a country that starts prosecuting presidents as soon as they lose this purported immunity, I mean, you think that, Trump's been calling for Obama to be locked up, ever since he learned that that was a phrase that would get a rise out of people. Definitely all sides of this are tough, but all the more reason that it should be well argued, well reasoned, and should stand up to scrutiny and to the legal test.
You've talked a lot before about the idea that the way we cover things has changed because of the bubbles that different media provide to different political parties, and Watergate would be maybe very different. You've talked about Nixon may have survived in a Fox News era. There's just different things like that. Debbie, one of our viewers, asked the question, how do you think this would have played out in today's landscape and media?
It's a very interesting question. I mean, I mentioned a minute ago that Agnew wanted to be impeached. Agnew went to the Speaker of the House, the Democratic Speaker of the House, and was basically like, could you please impeach me? Which is crazy. There's this moment where the Speaker of the House, Carl Albert, then refers that to the House Judiciary Committee chairman, a guy named Peter Rodino. And Rodino looks up from the letter that he has been handed from the Speaker of the House, and he says, would you please tell Vice President Agnew to go F himself? He doesn't say F, but he's like, this is crazy. He's asking to be impeached. But that's because Agnew thought that if he was being impeached, that would head off an indictment. And if you get impeached, you don't go to prison. Whereas if you get indicted, you might. But it's also because he thought if he could divert the track that he was on, which was at that point leading toward what might have been a 40 count felony indictment. If he could divert that to impeachment instead, even with Democrats in the driver's seat, he was pretty sure that he could fight it publicly in such a way that would preclude him being removed from office. He thought he could hold the line with Republicans because he, like Trump, and with many of the same hallmarks as Trump, was just unbelievably popular with the Republican base in a way that made it hard for elected Republicans to cross Agnew or to criticize Agnew, and almost none of them did. And so he wanted impeachment because he thought he could mount a public defense that would help him survive that. And if he'd survived that, he probably would have become president. And that would have been a mobocracy. That would have been crazy, especially after Nixon. So I think we've seen a little bit of what that would have been like. There was this moment where Nixon had told Agnew to quit, and Agnew didn't want to and wasn't going to. And he goes out and he talks to the California Republican Women's Convention in Los Angeles. And that's the one where, you might remember the sound from the podcast. He says, I will not resign if indicted. I will not resign if indicted. The coverage, the newspaper coverage of that event notes that some of the sort of rabid Agnew supporters among the Republican women at that event, they brought their own tape recorders to record his speech that day because they didn't trust the mainstream media to take his words in context, and they thought it would be misrepresented. And so they wanted tapes of it themselves, which they would distribute to their friends because you can't trust the media, and they would do it themselves. I mean, it's really very much like what we see with Trump. It's just, the size of our media organizations is bigger, and the speed at which news moves is faster.
There's a lot of kind of stranger than fiction moments in the book, asking for impeachment, among them. Also, one of them is the idea of a Democratic Speaker of the House from Oklahoma. That's also a strange concept.
Yes.
So the world has changed quite a bit. I'm curious, we've had a lot of questions about, obviously, indictments and pardons. Several people have touched on, who do you think is on the top of the pardons list right now, and will actually, that will actually happen. We've had so much speculation about the kids, and we've had so much speculation about Rudy Giuliani and all these other people. Do you see that actually playing out as advertised?
I think the president is in a very unpredictable place right now. I mean, I do feel like you look at the news right now, broadly speaking, and I mean, TV news and print news and sort of the reality-based world of news, left, right, and center. And you would expect even a sort of sore loser president or president having a hard time coming to terms with the election to be, sour and perhaps withdrawn and perhaps angry. But like the president is like still spinning up even more rapidly and still getting weirder and more intense in the way that he is publicly addressing the election, the results of the election that he lost. And I don't know where that ends for him. A lot of people who have worked with him in the past or who know him say that, he doesn't say things that are untrue. He doesn't tell lies, knowing that they're lies. He just decides to believe whatever is the most comfortable thing for him to believe. And it really does seem like right now he believes that there is an alternate universe in which, Hugo Chavez came back from behind the dead and used Brian Kemp in Georgia to elicit an Illuminati-based conspiracy. I mean, he seems to really believe it. And if he really believes it, well, what's a rational thing for somebody with those irrational beliefs? What's rational behavior from somebody if those are their true beliefs and he's not faking? I think that's very hard to predict. If I were him, what I would do, and I wanted to pardon my family and myself and do all, and I wanted to blow up American democracy as much as I could, which I think feels like that's what he's trying to do. I might issue 10,000 pardons. Yeah, and I put the whole Trump family and everybody I'd ever met and everybody who had anything to do with the administration on the list, but I'd sort of bury all the individual scandal preemptive pardons in a huge pile of them. I'd build a haystack so that nobody could find the needles. The White House counsel's office is going to have to go along with anything that he wants to do, and that is a daunting thing to ask somebody else to be part of. But once they've done what they've done, where do you draw the line?
Yeah, I try not to be cynical, and it's very difficult recently. But has anything that's happened since the election surprised you? I have not been surprised by any of the behavior. I'm just curious if there's anything that seemed even beyond what you expected.
I am seeing that. I didn't look at any news last night. I took yesterday and last night off and just kind of turned off my news consumption, but like kind of tuning back in even after just a little lapse there to see 4 people stabbed in one shot at Trump, election denialist rally in Washington. Like, really? And to see the sort of paramilitary organization, paramilitary, maybe we should call it, organization that's happening among the president's hardline supporters and stuff like that. That usually doesn't end well. And it usually doesn't peter out without some sparks of violence that can be quite dangerous. And so to see people getting hurt and see people getting stabbed and shot, and to see the president not at all cowed by that, but actually seemingly excited by that, I don't know if it's surprising, but it's sobering. We have to simultaneously absorb the ridiculousness of, the conspiracy theories. When it starts with Democrats are child-eating, Satan-worshiping cannibals, and then those people get newly conspiratorial ideas again, about Hugo Chavez and changed votes, and the 8 Coon guy with his cowboy hat on getting cited and putting on One America News, and then put in the affidavit for the Kraken lawsuit and all that. I mean, when it's that crazy, it's hard to not just cover it as a skit, as something that kooky. That said, when tens of millions of people want to get on board with that. And when most Republicans, and in fact, a majority of white men in this country believe that the election really was stolen, we're still heading toward a darker and darker place. It's not letting up. And that's, again, not surprising, but it is, you kind of have to adjust and like recalibrate with each new day of that.
You know, speaking of that rally, we had a rally here in Tulsa, as you know, with Trump on the weekend of Juneteenth, which was quite controversial. And what's interesting is, you know, obviously I'm biased by living here, but it seems to me that that was kind of a moment there, because what was interesting about it was what was happening in the summer with the George Floyd murder and all the things happening there. And then, of course, all the COVID issues that we were dealing with. It was this moment where those two things merged in a way, because you had the race massacre, the Juneteenth Greenwood area here in Tulsa, and then you had the COVID issue with gathering people, and those things overlapped on one big weekend here. And then we know how it turned out. There's that famous picture of him walking, you know, from the helicopter in kind of the most defeated way we had seen him up to that point. And it seems like there was something there, but I don't know, you covered that a lot, and it's still referenced. Your friend Michael Beschloss, who you're going to be in conversation with in a couple of days, actually mentioned it yesterday in reference to the rally that happened yesterday. I think he said, this rally makes Tulsa look like Woodstock in the size of him. As you know, he's got that great wit. But you know, do you see? And I don't mean, you don't need to speak about that moment, but are there two or three moments of this year that kind of became a collective Waterloo, or something that actually will go down as those were the moments where Trump lost?
That's interesting. I mean, just talking about the Tulsa rally too, the other consequence of that, the immediate consequence of that in Trump world, remember, is that he fired his campaign manager, because that Brad Parscale was his.
And Herman Cain, of course, too. Yes.
And Herman Cain ended up dying with COVID not long after that. But
Brad Parscale, yes.
Yeah, but Brad Parscale got ousted from Trump orbit, and he had been, whatever you think of him, and I think there's a lot of interesting backstory on Brad Parscale and his time in the Trump world, but that created a discontinuity between the Trump 2016 campaign and the Trump 2020 campaign. And the people who were running the Trump 2020 campaign, actually, you would sort of not believe it, but was kind of, in some cases, were slightly more kind of normal Republicans. Bill Stepien of Bridgegate fame and Chris Christie's political shop came on board after the Brad Parscale burnout or flame out. And that flame out caused, I think in large part by the disaster that was that Tulsa rally, and Brad Parscale's public statements about it that created these expectations that were so disappointing when they were compared with reality, that made reality so disappointing compared with them. So that may have been both a COVID watershed moment. That was the biggest congregate event held in America since the onset of the pandemic when it happened, held in direct defiance of public health orders. It caused a significant outbreak. It may have cost the life of Herman Cain. It was this huge disappointment for the president. He killed off his campaign manager because of it. We got that shot of defeat. I mean, all of that seems, that's a legit pivot. I would also say, though, that the president, nobody else talks about this, but it really sticks with me. Do you remember when the president said he was taking hydroxychloroquine? Yeah,
that was, or before that, that was in the early summer, maybe, yeah.
Yeah, so there was this, I still don't totally understand why right-wing media decided that there was a cure, and nobody wants you to know there's a cure. There's a cabal against the conspiracy against the cure. Like, if it was a cure, everybody would be happy. Nobody has any interest in there not being a cure. Nobody. But so there became this weird, like, Fox News primetime driven, like, hydroxychloroquine endorsement circle that apparently Wisconsin Senator Ron Johnson is still on board with, running the Homeland Security Committee in the Senate. But Trump took it a step beyond that, where he was stopped just kind of fanboying the Fox News coverage on it, and then actually announced that he was taking it. And then there was also, like, the sort of weird tail of that was when Steve Bannon was arrested after he'd been hiding out on the Chinese fugitives yacht. He said that he had been hiding out on the yacht taking hydroxychloroquine because that was like what connected people did to keep themselves from getting the COVID. Between that and like telling people that we should get light and disinfectant inside the body,
Yeah.
I do think that the president's supporters some of them must have loved that. But anybody who was at all soft in their Trump support or who had legitimate health concerns about COVID and knows enough to know how crazy that was, I think that was hard. I think that was hard for him to come back from. It was just, you never, ever wanted to take seriously anything he said having to do with COVID after that.
Would you say that that also applies to him actually when he got COVID?
I think that is more, I think it's going to take sort of a longer throw for us to understand what that did. One of the things that right now, if I had to say the impact of that, is that that was the first sign that we had, and there have now been many signs since, that people connected to this president and the president himself were going to get treatment that other people can't get. And we have seen that with, the president took those monoclonal antibody treatments that are incredibly rare. And there was a lot of interest around that because that was his treatment. But then the president made sure that Ben Carson got those monoclonal antibodies as well, and that Rudy Giuliani got those monoclonal antibodies as well. And somehow Chris Christie was able to get those monoclonal antibodies as well. Like, 300,000 Americans dead. It would be great if people could get those treatments through some means other than having Donald Trump's cell phone number. And to find out, as was reported in the Times tonight, that White House staff have all been told that they're all about to be vaccinated. When, wait a second, I thought it's health workers who are supposed to be vaccinated first. Like, if you work in the White House communications office, why are you first in line to get a vaccine? But that's how they're treating it. That actually may be the important legacy there, is the anger and the injustice, just pure injustice about the distributive this distributive corruption around promising treatment and vaccines.
Yeah. I'll remind everybody watching that we have about 2 million doses of hydroxychloroquine here in Oklahoma because our governor bought some. So if you guys need any, we've got it.
Wow.
So we've had a bunch of questions I'm sorry, we've had hundreds of questions, guys. I'm trying to kind of get a few things that are similar so we can answer a bunch of questions, but we've had a bunch of questions about what a return to a normal news cycle might look like after the inauguration, if that exists, and how you will kind of play a role in not over covering the president, who will still be tweeting constantly and doing all these things.
Yeah, it's interesting. This is a very live topic of discussion between me and the Rachel Maddow show producers at MSNBC. We've been talking a lot about this because, I think back to the 2008 election, when the Democrats came in with a landslide victory of Obama over McCain and 60 Democratic votes in the Senate-ish, and a huge House majority for the Democrats as well. And we did something in the aftermath of the election. Well, we did a lame duck watch for George W. Bush in terms of what the W administration was doing on their way out the door, which I totally thought we were going to do with the Trump administration, but he's not really a lame duck. He's instead become this mad king. And so lame duck actually, yes, the Trump administration is doing stuff on their way out the door, but the president doesn't seem to have anything to do with it. So it's kind of weird to do that. There's no parallel way to cover that. But we also did something called GOP in Exile, which was about the Republican Party having lost their grip on all forms of federal power in the wake of the 2008 election. And we tried to cover that in terms of understanding what the two-party state or the two-party political system that we have was going to be like when the Republican Party had to come back from really having been absolutely decimated in that Obama blue wave election. There is a version of that type of coverage that I am super interested in now, because it's not exactly parallel to 2008, right? The Republicans didn't lose a ton of seats in the Congress, and depending on what happens with the Georgia runoffs, it's possible that they will still control one seat in Congress. That said, Trumpism has done a number on the Republican Party in a way that is going to be really important to the country and to the two-party system in terms of the way it builds back. Now, if there's going to be a sort of paramilitary, proto-fascist street movement supporting Trumpism. Is that going to be an anti-Republican Party movement or a schismatic movement within the Republican Party that's still sort of conservatism? How is the Republican Party going to deal with that? It's going to be really important to see whether or not I ever cover a syllable that Donald Trump himself ever utters again. What the Republicans do with the sort of craziness within in the wake of Trump, I think is going to be very important and could potentially be dangerous in terms of the way that fractures. That also, even though I don't like stories that are media about media, I will also say that it makes the fate of Fox News important. Fox News, I've said in the past, I think, that is a kind of a jet engine that for a long time had this like rusted out hulk of an old dead Ford Pinto strapped to it. And that was the Republican Party. Like Fox News was the propulsive force of that. And the party itself actually wasn't all that together. It's not exactly true anymore, but if Fox News sort of becomes disfavored by a significant segment of the conservative viewing public and the Republicans in the country, it's really going to change what our two-party system is. It's going to change it from what it's been for the last 25 years. And super interested in that. And then, you know, the biggest governing challenges since World War II in terms of COVID and the disaster that is the wreckage of this economy and climate and everything else that Biden and Harris are going to have to deal with. I mean, I'm stressing myself out thinking about how to cover all of it right now, but none of it feels normal.
No, certainly not. We've got about 5-10 minutes left here. I just want to touch on a couple more things before we wrap up.
I will give shorter answers. I'm sorry I'm being so long-winded.
You talk. One of the more fascinating things in the book to me is the post-scandal Agnew and where he kind of leaned into his worst inclinations. And once again, it's a roadmap. One, could you kind of talk about, without kind of giving too much away, what he kind of ended up doing and championing in those later years, and then how you see that in what we're going to see in the next 4-8 years from the current president?
It's unnerving and weird in light of the current president. But what Agnew did after he was ousted from power is he basically became a foreign agent. He contacted the royal family in Saudi Arabia and asked them to fund him handsomely to basically become an anti-Semite for hire in the United States, to make him an agent of a foreign government paid for and sort of set up by the Saudis to foment anti-Semitic dissent in the United States. And he laid out all the different ways he wanted to do it and why he thought they should fund him. And he wanted exactly how much he wanted to be paid. And they did actually pay him to do some of that work. And he cashed their checks. He sort of became a shady foreign businessman for hire, but the offering himself as an international anti-Semite for the Saudi payroll and that working for him was, I don't know, is that beyond the pale, or is that exactly what we expect? What's the potential Trumpist parallel to that moving forward? I don't want to think about it, but it's worth knowing that's how ugly it got with him.
Yeah. So the Electoral College convenes, is it tomorrow?
In the individual states in DC, all the electors convene tomorrow, and then they convey their votes to Congress, and Congress counts the votes on January 6th.
Yeah. So what do you see happening with the Electoral College over the next short period? Is it going to be the thing where it's going to be what we expect, and that will be kind of, we've seen the system hold up a lot for the most part, which has been probably one of the more optimistic things we've seen, that the system and the places, the levers of democracy have worked. Do you see this kind of moving forward without too much drama actually in the system? Obviously, there will be a lot of outside forces talking about it, or do you see some major Hail Mary attempt in some way to do something here?
I mean, they're gonna stunt it somehow, right? They're gonna try some stunt. They're gonna do something to try to mount a stand here, if for no other reason than they can keep fundraising off of it. I don't know what the stunts are going to be. I will tell you that I was a little, not rattled, but like sat up and paid attention at the news reported at the end of last week that the electors in Michigan have been provided police protection specifically to get from their cars into the State House in Lansing because pro-Trump protesters are planning an open carry armed rally or protest, I guess it would be, at the State House while the electors are arriving. And so that's people with guns who are telling themselves that this is treason and you're a baby-eating cannibal who's coming to steal the election from Lord Emperor Donald Trump. And they're going to have loaded weapons while they do it. There will be, all the electors are convening in 50 different states, 50 different places. And I worry about some far-flung state capital and things getting weird. I don't put anything past the pro-Trump side at this point right now in terms of what they'll try to do. So I mean, I'm not going to guess what's going to happen, but I don't expect it procedurally to go wrong. I do expect them to do their worst when it comes to trying to force something to go wrong in the process.
Yeah. A lot of the new administration have talked about publicly, and I think some of our past presidents from both parties have said they're going to get vaccinated in public on television to kind of model that behavior and show that it's safe. I think Biden, maybe even this week I read, might be doing that.
Yeah.
Is that something, I'm curious, having the platform that you have, would you ever consider doing something like that, getting vaccinated on the show? I mean, obviously your audience is not necessarily a huge anti-vaxxer audience, but I'm just wondering if we're all supposed to be kind of playing a part.
Yeah.
This is very much a all hands on deck moment to kind of show this. Is that something you would ever consider doing?
First of all, Jeff, I'm so unbelievably, I don't know if I'm flattered or weirded out that you just segued from former presidents are getting the shot on TV. How about you, Maddow? Oh yeah, well, anytime I hear that, Clinton, W, and Obama are doing something, I wonder if Maddow might do it too. It's kind of weird to put me in that company. I have honestly never thought about this for 1 second before you just asked me for it, for all the obvious reasons. Sure. I mean, I would do anything that would help. Certainly. Yeah. I am deathly afraid of needles and get woozy.
That's even better reason to do it.
It is, unless what I modeled on TV was getting the shot and then passing out, which might not help in terms of convincing people to get the. When I was in local talk radio, actually not before I was even talk radio, when I was in music radio and I was a sidekick on a local morning show a million years ago in Western New England in a tertiary unrated radio market. Laser eye surgery was a new thing, and they were trying to convince people that it didn't hurt. And I got laser eye surgery live on the radio. And it seemed like it was going to be a great idea until me, on lots of Valium, started talking about how I was feeling and I can smell my eyeballs burning. And they were like, go to commercial.
Yeah, I mean, it may not be a great idea. I remember Katie Couric's colonoscopy on TV. I mean, it's not always a good idea to do these things. It's just the thought. I do wonder, what would Fred Rogers do? Fred Rogers would get his vaccination on the show, I would imagine, right? So that's always a good model.
I think the way we do it is that we'd have me get vaccinated, but we'd pre-tape it to make sure that I didn't either pass out or otherwise screw it up.
Or a tape delay.
There you go.
Well, this has been such a huge honor. I hope that the book is a huge success. Everyone who's watching, by the way, you guys are all getting a copy of the book. It's being sent to you as we speak. You're going to have a great time reading it or gifting it or reading it and then gifting it, because they won't know if you read it. Just be careful with the book. And maybe you got more than one copy for yourself too. So gosh, it's been just a huge pleasure. I was so thrilled to get the news that we were going to get to talk to you, and honored that we were one of the 2 spots that you picked. So it's been a great way to end a really crazy year. So.
Well, a piece of my heart lives in Tulsa. I half fell in love with Oklahoma from writing Blowout, a lot of which takes place in Oklahoma, but then visiting with you all down there and being so moved by the way that you guys handled that, and visiting Tulsa was so much fun for me. I didn't hesitate when I found out that I had a chance to come back. So I'm glad I'm really glad you're able to do it, Jeff, and it's great to see you.
Great to see you too. Happy holidays, and everybody out there, stay safe. Take care.
Thanks, you guys.
Bye. Take care.